and African relations, especially in the light of the warmth of the speeches by many African heads of state in the African Union summit in Rwanda, and which was a powerful reminder of the deep historical and cultural ties linking Egypt and many of its neighbors. It also revealed a shared belief in urgency of accelerating future engagement. Sub-Saharan Africa and Egypt share many things in common. We are at a similar level of development to many African countries, with a massive young population which is highly aspirational and tech savvy. Like many sub-Saharan countries, Egypt also struggles to find productive employment for many of its young people. Many countries across the region also have an abundance of natural resources, and our governments all have big visions for the future. In recognition of these similarities, Egypt has been working to bring new impetus and focus to its engagements in Africa, strengthening ties across all spheres, politically and commercially, bilaterally and also multilaterally. And to talk more and to shed more light on these relations, we're happy to have with us Dr. Tamer Mahmoud Ahmed, and he's a lecturer of anthropology as well as a researcher at the Institute of African Research and Studies. So welcome with us, Doctor.
Welcome to you and all your dear viewers.
Good afternoon, Dr. Tamer.
Good afternoon.
And, since you are a lecturer of anthropology, perhaps it's important to start with shedding light on the African dimension that is fundamental in the Egyptian civilization and character. How is the African dimension deep into the Egyptian character?
Yes, actually, first of all, let's highlight the difference. Let's highlight a very important point. There is no difference between being Egyptian and being African. We are African after all.
Yes.
Therefore, there's this party between being an Egyptian and an African. Actually, one day Nelson Mandela came to Egypt, and he stated that Egypt is the cradle of the African civilizations. We should adhere to Africa as being our homeland, being our mother continent, and we are all sharing it. Therefore, let's talk about ourselves as being Africans. That's the first point. Second point, as regarding the similarities between Egypt and the African nations, as we are sitting next to the River Nile, one of the greatest similarities about here is, for most of the African countries is the culture. We share so much common cultural values, cultural practice, cultural way of living. If we can explain culture like this as the way of living. If you know, this Nile passes through 11 African countries. Along its banks lives almost 437 million African people, African souls on the Niles. That's why Egypt and Africa shares so much in common. Even our constitution, 2014 constitution, it's written clearly that Egypt is the tip of Africa. That's the most important way of documentation of our African identity and the African dimension of our Egyptian identity. That's the first point. Second point about the Egyptian civilization. When we are talking about Egyptian civilization, we are covering a very extensive period of time, thousands of years. Therefore, we cannot just put it in very short, in different intervals. But who can decline or who can neglect the African impact on the Egyptian civilization and the Egyptian impact on the African civilization as well? Recently, in the period of President Abdel Nasser, who can neglect the Egyptian role in the reparation movements? For a period of time, there have been a gap between Egypt and the African countries. But since the revolution of 30th of June, we have seen Egypt back to embrace its role in Africa and take its normal size. Yes. If I may elaborate on this, may state, Egypt is the third largest economy in the continent and the first army by its strength. Therefore, what we see today about the weight and the impact of Egypt in Africa is not at all matched to its size historically, economically, or even by power. Why this? Because for a period of time, the awareness of our African dimension have been absent from our thoughts. Now we have to work on this. We have to work on enhancing our relations with our Africans. I don't want to use the word neighbors. Actually, what we share between Egypt and the African peoples are more than being neighbors.
Beyond that,
yes, of course, it's ties, brotherhood ties, history ties. We can date this to the dawn of the human civilization. if we can do this even on a physical and historical background, we have to reinforce this in all aspects. Yes.
Well, Doctor, what are the cultural and economic aspects that ties Egypt with Africa that we can use for our mutual cooperation?
Okay. What are the cultural aspects that tie between us and Africa? First, we have to redefine again the word culture, as I have stated earlier. Culture, its simple definition, is the way of living of a people. If you go and see a village in Aswan in Egypt, or a village along the banks of the Nile in Uganda, in Nigeria, in Uganda, in Congo, in Rwanda, in Burundi, you will be astonished about the similarity. You cannot feel a stranger in Africa, despite the fact that we have different physical features, different color tones, but still we have the same ways of living. One thing more, as you have stated in the report introduction, that all the African countries face the common challenges. They have challenges as regarding security, they have challenges as regarding education, they have challenges as regarding their economic position, they are all facing corruption, they are all facing terrorism. Therefore, we can name it the African experience. All the African countries are living through the same phase and experience, and what we can stress here is that this is the ideal time for integration. Some African countries are very wealthy in their resources. Some African countries are lacking such resources like minerals or like land resources. Some African countries have got a wealth of youth. Some other countries are underpopulated. This is the ideal situation where we can all be integrating together to form a unity, a very viable unity between this. Not to be away from the topic and the culture way of living. African culture is very distinguished and very distinctive. You can immediately see it whenever anywhere in the world, like the African music, the African art, the African songs, the African speeches, the African languages. Therefore, we as Egyptians and the other African countries, historically we share common language sources. The Arabic and the African countries are closely related. It goes beyond saying that 45% of the African populations are Muslims and 40% are Christians. Therefore, almost 85% of the total African population share common religious beliefs as us here in Egypt. We can capitalize on this. Actually, when we see the case now, how can such a group of countries, 54 countries, having so much similarities between each other, are so much apart and not able to integrating together to form a unity, a viable unity that has impact on each one and each person of their population? It's very
suffering from interconflicts as well.
That's the main point we have to state this. How can such close countries have conflicts except if you are thinking alone beyond the benefit of your own African brothers?
Yes.
Therefore, if you are together sharing, for example, the Nile, something we term the hydropolitics, populations living around the Nile, why you are want to do your own or to get your own benefit without thinking about all the other 10 countries living around the Nile peasants? It's strange actually. The conflict in Africa, I think, is not related to cultural difference or ethnic differences, although sometimes it is the trigger. But actually, I think it's sometimes related to the mismanagement of the conflict.
Yes.
How these conflicts are mismanaged and how this can serve a bigger plan for the other forces out of Africa.
Exactly.
Yes, and that's why we should stress about the concepts. Africa for the Africans. No one is going to interfere in Africa, or no one is knowing the benefit of the African people and the African nations, except the inhabitants of Africa, the people of Africa.
Yes. Dr. Tamer, the movement of goods and people across the Grand Free Trade Area, known as the GFTA, which envisages the combining of the common market for Eastern and Southern Africa, known as COMESA, the Southern African Development Community SADC, and the East African EAC region blocks into one single market. Now, how possible is this in your own opinion? Will this come into existence very soon, especially with the launch of the e-passport?
Yes. Will this come to actually soon? Actually, we have got a very, I don't need to use the word strange. Actually, it's strange. We have got many agreements written through Africa. They have got many good intentions for African integration.
They did not come into effect.
Yes, actually, they never come actually to materialize on the ground before having effect.
So is it a problem of mechanism of implementing these
Actually, I think it's a problem of conflicting agenda between the African countries and the political will to implement and materialize such an agreement. As you have stated, such great wars like the Grand Freedom Movement area or the Comesa. And one very landmark in this is the issuing of the AU passport, part of the results of the African Union Summit held in Kigali. Expected to be by 2018, it's going to be Africa is a border-free continent. Why can't we feel this on the ground, and why can't feel this in improvement economic conditions? Of course, it's a step, and of course, it's a major step in this. Having the free goods and free movement of people and of trade throughout Africa without needing a passport is very, very great and major step. This is going for sure to have impact as long as we have got political will and as long as we have to work together as brothers to materialize such agreements into the ground for the sake of the African people. Should we hope for the best? Of course, it's a step, it's there, sometimes going to be materialized. But the conditions overall and globally are not now just for favoring. The point here, and the point we get from the African Union Summit for the leaders meeting, that all the leaders have expressed their concern and their sincere support for a people unity of all the African people for the welfare of Africans. And that's why we should wait and see. Of course, we are on the way. We may be going slowly, but we are on the right track, hoping for this.
Well, human and women rights remain a critical issue, and actually these were some of the topics which were discussed during the summit, where the first ladies held their own meetings discussing women's rights and the various problems facing women, and then also there were other talks about human rights. Would you tell us about in terms of challenges, what are the challenges that we'll be encountering to be able to overcome such issues?
Yes. The African Unit in Kigali, the African Summit in Kigali have been held under the theme of human rights, especially the rights of women. Mm-hmm. Why are women very important in Africa? First of all, because women are the most vulnerable group. Vulnerable group means that in case of any political turmoil or any economic turmoil, the most affected segment of the society are the women in Africa. We face in Africa violence against women. It's very prominent. We have seen child labor. We have seen lack of education for children. These conditions threatens the main existence of the African identity and the African continent and the health of the African populations. Therefore, this was very important to be discussed in the African Union Summit. What we can do in this, actually the agenda, the overall agenda for Africa in cooperation with 2063 total development of the African continent. There is a very strengthening point, or very strengthening theme of empowerment women. Empowerment women means giving them equal rights for participation in their life, giving them proper education, providing them with health care, increasing the awareness of gender-based violence against women, and enhancing their condition, living condition, and working condition. That's a very important point we have all to address, even not only from development aspect, but also from humanitarian and the political aspect. Even in Egypt here, we've seen that women are the main force, the main power that's going to push the economy. And
there was a focus by President Sisi on women in every speech.
That's actually
they are the moving force. Yeah.
Women are changing the faces in Egypt now. We have got very prominent women. We have got Ambassador Mushira Khattab. She is running for presidency of the UNESCO now. We have got women as ministers. We are going to see women as a parliament member. It's very important to empower the role of women, and women have got a very high percent for political engagement in Egypt in the last few years. We've seen the lines of women waiting to vote in the elections, either in the parliamentary election or the presidential election. But if I may take 1 minute, taking the chance of being here about Egypt and Africa, actually about the cultural aspects of Egypt and Africa and how to enforce this. We have to focus upon the media role in this. We have to focus upon media increasing the Egyptian awareness of their African identity by itself. We have to see African movies in in the Egyptian TV. We have to see African football match, strengthening the culture.
We do see African football matches. that's one thing that we do.
No, the one thing, yes, I totally agree with you. But the main thing here, I have to say that increasing the cultural ties between Egypt and Africa does not by any means means exporting our culture to Africa. Actually, it's a two-way process. You have to show your culture to the other and understand the culture of others. We have first to seek to be understood before seeking to understand. That's how it goes.
Well, if we're talking about the media, Dr. Tamer, that was a trend that was launched during the 60s, during President Abdel Nasser, in the radio stations directed to Saharan countries and African countries. But then it all died away, unfortunately.
Actually, I need here to focus also not only African football matches to see, actually to broadcast the African football match on our channels, to have pages in the newspaper about the African affairs, to change our curriculums in the school, to have an open African museum, to show the African cultures and make the Egyptians aware of their African origins and how enriched this African continent and how it's very unique, how it's very distinguished. We see tourism
we
come
in
to
Nile
Africa.
TV, we have a program
Yes.
called Africa Today, and it's
Yes,
dedicated
actually,
to African.
it's my dream to see a channel named Africa Today or Egypt Africa.
Yes.
Yes, broadcasting with different African languages. Because when we go to the African nations, sometimes I myself have been to Uganda, I have been to Tanzania. Sometimes our image is totally mingled with them. They don't know actually, they hear about us, but they never hear from us. They have never seen us. And it's time to present the true image of the new Egypt to the African people with the African language in African perspective.
Yes.
As we are Arabs and focus on Arab, are also Africans.
Yes. Dr. Tamer, President Abdel Fattah Sisi's participation in the 27th AU Summit that took place in Kigali, Rwanda, was meant to foster Egypt's role in Africa and bolstering Cairo's ties with African countries as part of new strategies, as you kindly mentioned, in opening new chapters or reinforcing Egypt's relations with other African countries, especially when it comes to achieving economic and social developments, peace and stability in the continent. How do you see that, sir?
Yes, I think that's a very good and very great strategic dimensions of the foreign affairs to focus on Africa. Actually, Africa have suffered from neglectance in our foreign strategy, our policies in the last 15 years, let's say, about this. We are paying now the price of being out of Africa. Our size on the African stage is not matched to our power and our existence throughout history. President Fattah Sisi have been keen to attend all the African Union summit held and have been keen to make mutual or bilateral relations between different presidents in Africa. Is Africa important to Egypt? Actually, this goes beyond saying blank questions. We can't actually have an economic development and we can't have peace in Egypt without our African relations. Is Africa a great market to be? Of course it is. Africa is a great market for the Egyptians. Therefore, if Egypt is looking for a market for export our trades, you know a very sad number that the African countries' economic relation with Egypt only comprise 3% of the total African growth. It's very small number compared to our weight and our power of our economy. Therefore, if you want to have a better economic conditions, we should work with Africa. We cannot neglect Africa because we are deep-rooted in Africa. Africa is not only close to Egypt. Africa is in the heart of Egypt. Therefore, if something happened in Cape Town, we are going to suffer here in Cairo.
Indeed, Doctor. Sure, it's sure, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Tamer Mahmoud Ahmed, lecturer of anthropology and researcher at the Institute of African Research and Studies. Thank you very much for this interview. Thank you.
You so much. It's pleasure all mine.
Thank you. Well, we'll be back after the break, so stay with us.